Welcome to Distance Learning brought to you by the Palm Beach County School District Office of African, African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. Today's lesson is part one of the modern civil rights movement. For this lesson, you will need to access the African American History lesson plans located on the School District of Palm Beach County Google Curriculum site. Within the lesson plans, you will find the materials that correspond to this lesson. During this lesson, students will explain the significance of Brown versus the Board of Education. Students will explain how the death of Emmett Till impacted the civil rights movement. And students will identify the origins and outcomes of the Montgomery Bus boycott. Activate your thinking. Read the following question. What events do you think lead to the beginning of the modern civil rights movement? Take a moment to reflect. Let's begin by setting the stage. For most white Americans in the 1950s, this was an era of prosperity. Affluent white Americans fled to the suburbs by 1960. 52% of Americans owned their own homes. For most Black Americans, the 1950s were less blissful. American society remained segregated in housing and education, and Jim Crow still reigned. Black Americans still suffered as a result of economic and political oppression. It is important to understand that the fight for civil rights didn't begin in the 1950s. Throughout history, Black people have fought an arduous battle for equality, empowerment, and democracy. This lesson will focus on the modern civil rights movement that took place in the 1950s and 60s. We're going to begin by talking about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or Legal Educational Fund, and Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. The NAACP did not settle for the separate but equal doctrine set by Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1940, the NAACP created the Legal Defense Educational Fund to attack legal foundations of race inequality in American education, and also fought against segregation and discrimination in housing, employment, and politics. Within education, the NAACP won several cases that set the stage for the Supreme Court to reconsider the separate but equal doctrine. This would lead to the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas victory in 1954. When we talk about the legal battle within education, it is important to know that this included higher education at the university level, as well as local public schools. In 1950, when the all-white Sumner School in Topeka, Kansas refused to admit a Black student by the name of Linda Brown, her father, Oliver Brown, filed a lawsuit and testified in court that his daughter had to travel an hour and 20 minutes to attend a Black school. The Sumner School was only 7 blocks away, but practiced racial exclusion. The lawsuit claimed that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Linda became the named plaintiff in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional within education. The landmark case became one of the cornerstones of the modern civil rights movement. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that desegregation would take place with all deliberate speed. However, the desegregation of schools would take a while. A lot of state leaders challenged the law and refused to integrate schools, forcing the federal government to get involved. The victory did not eradicate Jim Crow. It fueled the resistance of most whites in regards to the civil rights movement. Another defining moment during the civil rights movement was the kidnapping and lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955. The lynching of Emmett Till and the acquittal of his murderers reflected the low regard in which Black life was held in the Jim Crow South. The Till lynching shaped the consciousness of a generation of young African American activists, partly because of his mother's unwillingness to let America turn away from this crime. Next, we're going to discuss a pivotal moment during the modern civil rights movement, the Montgomery Bus boycott. The Montgomery Bus boycott brought about new forms of protest. Several organizations came together to figure out how to challenge the social issues of racism. Joanne Robinson wrote to the mayor of Montgomery on behalf of the Women's Political Council, reiterating the complaints by the Black community regarding conditions on the city buses. To ride the city buses, Blacks will have to pay their fare up front, exit the bus, and enter through the rear of the bus. The buses would stop at almost every corner in white neighborhoods, but did not in Black neighborhoods. Unfortunately, her concerns were ignored. Community organizations worked to develop a strategy to challenge segregation. On March 2nd, 1955, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin refused to obey transportation segregation laws in Montgomery. She refused to give up her seat to a white woman. The Montgomery Women's Political Council wanted to use Colvin's incident to initiate the bus boycott. For various reasons, community leaders decided against protesting Claudette's conviction for allegedly assaulting a police officer. They decided to wait for another chance to protest. Nine months later, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist who worked as a seamstress, refused to give up her seat as well. Rosa Parks is often depicted in history as a little old woman who was tired after a long day of working and simply refused to give up her seat. The truth is that Rosa Parks was a 43-year-old woman who had trained and prepared for this moment. Her act of resistance launched the Montgomery Bus boycott. Rosa Parks was arrested for violating Montgomery's transportation law. She was ordered to appear in court the following Monday. Soon after she was bailed out of jail, Joanne Robinson and Edie Dixon began circulating flyers calling for a one-day boycott. The bus boycott started December 5th, 1955. Joanne Robinson would become one of its chief strategists and would also form the Montgomery Improvement Association to coordinate the boycott. The organization selected 26-year-old minister Martin Luther King Jr., or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as its president. Dr. King had the ability to inspire others. He taught others how to respond using nonviolent tactics. This would mark the beginning of his role as a leader of the civil rights movement. Many Black women depended on the buses to go to work. Some walked 12 miles per day during the boycott. Some white employers provided transportation for them. But many Black women decided to organize a carpool of 200 vehicles to provide transportation to those who need to get to and from work. As a result, the boycott took 65% of the bus company's business, forcing it to cut pay, lay off workers, and raise fares. Black and white activists in the North supported the activism in the South. Activists in Chicago and New York were fighting for equality as well. After Dr. King was indicted on conspiracy to disrupt the bus system, Bayard Rustin came to Montgomery to assist with the boycott. He would become one of King's most trusted advisors. The bus boycott alone could not stop segregation. During this entire process, the NAACP had taken the cases of a few local women who were arrested at the start of the boycott to court. Those women were Claudette Colvin, Ariella Browder, Susie McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith. Due to Brown precedent, on November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court in Browder v. Gale ordered an end to Montgomery's bus segregation and overturned the convictions of these women. The bus company agreed to end segregation, and they also agreed to hire Black drivers. As a result, Dr. King, with the help of Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, and Stanley Levinson, would go on to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This organization would provide an institutional base for the civil rights movement. When we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, we always talk about Dr. King and Rosa Parks. As you can see from this lesson, there were many people involved in this strategic process. This boycott did not happen by chance. It was planned and executed by people who were deeply committed to ending the racism and inequality that plagued their community. Next week, we will discuss the role of Black youth during the Civil Rights Movement, the March on Washington, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This concludes week 3's lesson. As you reflect on today's lesson, think of 3 things you've learned, 2 things you would like to learn more about, and 1 question you still have. Thank you for listening.